Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, a look at the nail-biting wins and devastating defeats at the Africa Cup of Nations.
It's my favorite tournament. Every 2 years when it comes around, I just stop. I work, but I sort of stop and find a way to watch literally every game.
I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. This Sunday brings the final match of the Africa Cup of Nations. But the game that's on many people's minds and lips happened on Wednesday between South Africa and Nigeria.
I would say for a team of locally based players to take on a team of Nigeria with all that talent of mostly players who play in the world's top leagues in Europe, we didn't embarrass ourselves. We made it, so I'm happy. I'm quite happy.
That's Sean Jacobs. He's not just a South Africa football fan. He's also the founder of the website Africa is a Country and a professor of international affairs at the New School in New York City. So, Sean, let's talk about AFCON, the Africa Cup of Nations. Semifinals just finished. And yet a quick scroll through my socials show me lots of people are still talking about a match from Wednesday between Nigeria and South Africa.
20 minutes penalties will determine who goes through to the final.
It was a game where you are on the edge of your seat until the last second. Tell me about that game, your reaction to it, and why people are still talking about it now.
So, as everybody knows, I'm South African. So obviously, I had a stake in this game. And I think the game mattered because on the one hand, you had Africa's kind of superpower, Nigeria, with some of the best footballers playing in some of the best leagues in Europe. The South African team consisted mostly of players who play in local leagues in South Africa. So it was kind of like the giants of Africa against sort of an unfancy team. I also think that the South Africans, we had just, taken Israel to the International Court of Justice.
At the United Nations highest court, Israel stands accused of carrying out genocide in Gaza. South Africa has filed a 84-page document with the International Court of Justice in The Hague.
And we had sort of won some kind of moral victory there. So South Africa's riding a wave. And just being in the match, I think how I felt at the beginning, I was realistic. I expected South Africa to play well, but I thought we would be overwhelmed by the Nigerians. And as the game progressed, I felt a little better because we were basically playing better. Nigeria came across as lethargic, kind of unimaginative. And the longer we played, the stronger we got. So I thought, perhaps we have another upset because they got a penalty. There was, I think, about 30 minutes left. And with 5 minutes to go,
They find a second. It's a tap-in for Osimhen.
they scored a goal. VAR called it back.
Maybe a possible penalty there for South Africa in the box.
Yeah, this is going all the way back. Penalty to South Africa.
Yeah,
Clear penalty.
We got a penalty.
In the 90th minute, Mokoena strikes firm. He strikes true.
Made it 1-1. And I think I was actually at work watching it with some colleagues. We had kind of commandeered a conference room. And everybody was sort of looking at me like, what? I don't think they'd seen that side of me.
What is that side?
Sort of screaming, also like willing us to win, but also talking myself into defeat. So in case we lose,
Right.
These are the reasons why we losing.
Yep.
But I think when the match ended, I was proud, but I was also exhausted. Because we're also like Nigeria. We're kind of a very loud, confident nation who think we should lead the continent. There's also a certain kind of exceptionalism that goes with being South African. But yeah, just proud and exhausted. So something that's, I don't know, football does that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it does, which explains this outswelling of support we saw. South Africa was sort of the people's team in this. But to avid football watchers, it is probably safe to say that few would have bet on South Africa's team making it to the semifinals. As you mentioned, they don't have internationally recognized players. They haven't qualified for the World Cup, which is the pinnacle of success for a national team, arguably, in more than 2 decades. And of course, that doesn't include 2010 when they got automatic qualification as the host country. But then Wednesday comes and they are out on that pitch against Nigeria, one of Africa's top teams, holding their own. Tell me about the team. What should we know about them and how they got this far?
So, as you said, South Africa, by some estimates, it's glass half full. Most countries would kill to have gone to the World Cup twice, to qualify for the World Cup twice. We did it on our first try in 98, right after we got our independence. We did it at the subsequent World Cup in 2002 in Japan and Korea. And then after that, we never qualified except the fact that we hosted in 2010. So there was the sense that South African football had declined, that we couldn't compete at that level. And so going into the tournament, many of the South African players, the players who play in the South African team in the tournament, they play in the South African League. And this was said to count against you at AFCON, at the African Cup of Nations. And usually in African football, coaches pick players who play in Europe, and then also players who've represented, say, England, France, especially the Netherlands, Belgium at youth level. And of course, that makes sense. They have better training, better coaching. They have access to better infrastructure than they have on the continent. The South African players all played for the same club, which is called Sundowns. And if you follow African football, this team, can you hold on because my cat is in the room. I don't know how she got in here.
Sure.
And I have to get her out of here because she's playing.
Sean may be in New York, but his heart is still in South Africa. Okay. That even came through when we were interrupted by his cats, named after 2 songs from the world-famous South African musician Miriam Makeba. What's your cat's name?
Pata.
What does that mean?
It's pata.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Miriam Makeba, yeah. I have another cat. It was called Malika, which is also Miriam Makeba. Anyway, so let me start where I said something about Sundowns.
Yeah.
What I think the South Africans, they were onto something, because 8 of the South African team, they play for this one club, Sundowns. And if you know African football, then you know that Sundowns are giants. They've won the African Champions League. They're the only club from southern part of the continent who've actually won this tournament in recent times. So that, I think, in itself was a good thing. Secondly, most of the players know each other. As I said, most coaches rely on players who play in Europe. They come together like a week or 2 before the tournament. They have to get to know each other while playing together. Well, these players from South Africa, they always play together. And I think the last one, which is the South African Domestic League, is one of the best in Africa. It's very competitive. It's well organized. And if you're a South African player, you actually don't have to leave South Africa. You can play for a South African club instead of going to play, say, in Cyprus, Turkey, Belgium, which are the kind of clubs that you would see on the rosters of all these other national teams in the tournament. And so in the end, I think those are, for me, the reasons why South Africa did well.
After the break, a silent protest by players from the DRC and why we didn't see more politics showing up at the pitch. So, Sean, let's then take stock of where we are right now. Some might call this a tournament of upsets, starting with the host country, Ivory Coast, which has made it to the finals, but not without losing a few key matches along the way. What has that path been like for them, and what is significant about that team?
If you have a tournament, any tournament, what you want to do is you want the host to do well. Because otherwise the stadiums start to clear out and the locals, they lose interest. And so For Côte d'Ivoire, they started like a house on fire. They won their first game.
Into the back of the net, doubling the score for Côte d'Ivoire. They are roaring at the end of the opening game at the Africa Cup of Nations.
I think it was 2-0. But then you played 3 group games and they lost the next 2 group games, first to Nigeria and then to Equatorial Guinea. And the Equatorial Guinea game, they lost like 4-0. So they were obviously going to be knocked out of the competition. And they only made it as one of there were 4 teams outside the teams who automatically qualified for the round of 16. There were 4 best third place teams, and they made it as one of those teams. And so there was a lot of, gnashing of teeth. If you saw videos circulating or news reports, you may have seen, Ivoirians coming out of the stadium crying, being frustrated. What the federation did was they fired the coach. He's from France.
The Ivory Coast have sacked their coach, Jean-Louis Gasset, midway through the tournament.
And it was quite dramatic. It was unprecedented. You don't do that in the middle of a tournament. It's also sort of a sign of chaos. And as a host, it just doesn't inspire confidence. The weird thing is it actually had the opposite effect. They picked like one of the assistant coaches. He had very little experience as a coach. He took over the team. And then since then, they beat Senegal, who were the champions in the last tournament. They beat Mali in the quarterfinals by scoring a goal in the last minute of regulation. And you can imagine how this just kind of built up for like a country. And if you saw the scenes after the match on Wednesday, when they won against DR Congo to go to the final against Nigeria.
Ball in here, chance for number 2. Tight angle. The hosts are into the final.
It shows you, particularly in a country like Côte d'Ivoire, which had a history of civil war, in which there are questions around, the notion of like who's Ivorian, a national identity, and to see this kind of like what the tournament I think has done for a place like that is to contribute to its national unity. For many of these players, particularly the players from the diaspora, it means a lot to go play in AFCON. You're playing for the national team. When you play in Europe, it's very lonely. So when you come back to the continent, whatever gets into your parts, a coach being fired in the middle of the tournament, often it can't put you off this quest to win this elusive thing called the African Cup of Nations.
So, Sean, I want to linger on that match just a little because in that last match to get to the finals, Ivory Coast played the Democratic Republic of Congo. And while the DRC may have lost, they left an impression. During their national anthem, some players staged a protest. They covered their mouths with one hand, and they held up their other hands in the symbol of a gun. And they're drawing attention to the fighting in the eastern part of their country. How else has politics showed up on the pitch in this tournament? Because that's not unique.
The interesting thing is I expected there to be a lot more politics. I think there was a section of the crowd that displayed Palestinian flags in one of the group games by some North African fans. But for some reason, you didn't see much protests within the tournament. FIFA clamps down a lot on players expressing, any political or religious symbols or making any protests.
All these European teams pulled out from wearing these armbands to show their solidarity for LGBTQ rights at the last minute because FIFA had suggested that the captains would be penalised and maybe even potentially get a yellow card.
It doesn't mean that players haven't done so, but it's very rare these days to get footballers to express themselves politically. You saw it in the Asian Cup with the Palestinian footballers.
A moment of silence in memory of the tragic lives lost as a result of the ongoing situation in Palestine.
But for some reason in this African tournament, there's been very little expression about politics on the field.
So, Sean, what are you looking forward to in the finals?
I mean, throughout this tournament, I have this sort of irrational, for me, it's irrational. I have this wager, which I root for countries that are, if they're more democratic. And so I think this one is a tough one. Both Nigeria and Côte d'Ivoire are democracies. The thing, I mean, it's a great final. you have Africa's best player against the host nation. In fact, Osimhen, who runs the front line for Nigeria, he plays for Napoli, and he had just been voted Africa's best player.
Wow.
You know, that's what you want when you do like a final of a tournament like this. Nigeria favorites, I think that's clear. They already beat Cote d'Ivoire. The score was, I think, 1-0, but it was very clear that they dominated that match. They were very slick. They've also sort of in some way finally figured out how to get the best out of the football of all these players who play everywhere else in Europe. So I think Nigeria is going to win. Nigerians are very good with the banter online. I think it's going to be unbearable.
Yeah. It's already started. The TikToks, the Reels.
Yeah, it's already started. But Cote d'Ivoire has also shown something else, which is in this tournament, a game is not over until the referee blew the whistle at the last minute. So I can't give up on Cote d'Ivoire. They've shown that they deserve. They got together, and they, after some disappointment in the earlier part of the tournament. So, you know, both teams, I wish them well, but my suspicion is Nigeria is gonna win.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Chloe Cayley and Fahrinisa Campana, with Zainab Badr, Sonia Abou-Gad, David Enders, Sari Al-Khalili, Miranda Lynn, Ashish Malhotra, Nagin Oliai, Khalid Sultan, Amy Walters, and me, Malika Bilal. Alex Roldan is our sound designer. The Take's executive producer is Alexandra Locke, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back.